May 27, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk were chaos made flesh. Smoke from burning ships hung thick over the shallow water, mingling with cries of men and the staccato rat-a-tat of German artillery. Thousands of Allied soldiers were trapped between the sea and a relentless enemy. Every officer seemed overwhelmed, every plan fraught with uncertainty. Yet amid this storm, a single figure moved with uncanny precision. Private John Jack Godfrey, a young British scout assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Royal Scots. Jack wasn't a hero by reputation. He was quiet, observant, and trained to notice what others ignored. A gap in enemy patrols, the sound of boots in the sand, the direction of the wind carrying the smell of smoke and cordite. The higher-ups dismissed him as cautious, even slow, but caution was about to become genius. That morning, Jack received an impossible assignment: cross 500 yards of open beach under direct enemy observation to deliver crucial intelligence about a German flanking maneuver to the command bunker. Every other runner had failed or been shot before reaching halfway. But Jack studied the terrain, noting the scattered debris, the position of fallen men, and even the reflections of sunlight on broken water pools that might give him away. He didn't run blindly. Instead, he calculated the rhythm of enemy fire, used small dips in the sand as cover, and crawled low in a zigzag path that made him nearly invisible. A shell landed mere feet away, throwing sand into his face, but he kept moving. Hours felt like minutes, the beach a stretch of both terror and opportunity. By the time he reached the bunker, Jack had accomplished something unbelievable. He delivered the intelligence, altering the evacuation plan for hundreds of soldiers waiting further down the beach. Commanders implemented his recommendations immediately, adjusting boat landings and timing to minimize exposure to German fire. No one outside the bunker realized that a single scout's careful observations and courage had prevented what could have been a massacre. Jack's name wouldn't go into dispatches yet, but his actions would ripple through Dunkirk in ways that would only be understood later, when the evacuation succeeded against all odds. By late afternoon, the sea at Dunkirk looked like a bad wound. Black water smoking where ships had been hit, bits of wreckage drifting like driftwood, and men huddled on the sand, moving in clusters that felt more like flocks than units. Jack Godfrey wiped grit from his eyes, folded the paper with his notes into the inside of his jacket, and watched the horizon. The intelligence he'd brought to the bunker changed a timetable, but only by minutes, and in a place like Dunkirk, minutes were everything. Commanders rerouted the next evacuation wave to a narrower stretch of beach, sheltered by the ruins of a breakwater and the skeleton of a sunken destroyer. Boats came in thinner columns, zigzagging through floating debris. The change saved lives, dozens at first, then hundreds, but it also exposed a new vulnerability. The narrow corridor funneled men into a choke point where any effective German observation could cause catastrophic losses. Boots would pile up like logs. The command needed someone who could move fast between the embankments, assess real-time danger, and act on instinct. For reasons that pleased Jack and alarmed him, they asked him for another run. This time Jack was to cross the open spit again, but under a different imperative. Find the route of least detection between the wrecks, time the landing boat's approach, and, if possible, signal the extraction launches with a visual code. It was a job for a runner, a scout, a man who could read the beach like a chessboard. The cost of error would be visible and immediate. He chose his path with the care of a man cutting through a field of tripwires. Instead of following the line of trenches or the predictable dips in the sand where others walked, he hugged the debris, tires, crates, the split hull of a lifeboat, letting them break the silhouette he knew German observers searched for. He crawled where he could, ran where there was cover, and always moved at angles the enemy would least expect. Shells hammered near the sunken destroyer. Their concussion rattled his teeth, but he learned early on to use the cadence of the bombardment as a shield. Move during the blast, hold during the silence. Near a cluster of half-submerged rails, he found what a dozen other scouts had missed: a narrow gap where the water pooled deeper, forming a reflective patch that played tricks on the eye. From above, that patch looked like a glinting hazard, perfect for hiding men beneath its glare. Jack marked the spot with a small stack of stones, as he'd once marked a trail for a hunting party back home. Soon he would teach others to read that marker without a word. But the beach held smaller dangers than shells. A group of French soldiers were pinned behind a slab of concrete, their eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion born of repeated failed attempts. Jack crawled toward them, whispered a plan, quick movements, smoke canister for cover, a coordinated dash, and somewhere between the calculus of risk and hope, they moved. The dash was messy, men fell, curses flew in a dozen languages, but the small band made it to the waterline. For a moment the world narrowed to the weight of a single life carried across a few yards of surf. It was a small, bright triumph, and Jack felt the strange rush of a man who had done something that mattered. Word of the marker and the dash spread by rumor among the waiting men. A petty officer took Jack by the sleeve and handed him a length of rope and a small hand flag, just a scrap of red cloth. "If you can, kid, get to that shipwreck at the angle of the pier and tell the master to hold fire for 3 blasts, the petty officer said. 3 blasts and a line of skiffs will pull straight in. We'll lose fewer men." Jack was already moving. The wreck at the pier was a ruined trawler half submerged, its deck a bone of timber. To reach it, he had to cross an expanse where German spotters had clear sight. He waited until a shadow collimated by a cloud passed overhead and sprinted, low and quick. He slid under a splintered rail and found shelter in the cavity of the hull. Inside, a single seaman with ash-streaked cheeks blinked at him like a man who had seen too much. Jack relayed the plan, 3 blasts, and watched the sailor snuff the cheek sparks and nod. The small victory was not without consequence. A German reconnaissance plane made a low pass exactly then. Its observer saw movement on the sand, and the machine gun on the plane tracked the hull's silhouette. The trawler shuddered under strafing, timbers splintered, and a fire began where flares of fuel met twisted steel. The seaman raised the red scrap, and with the same air of terror and duty, blew 3 frantic blasts on a hand trumpet. For a breathless minute, every man on the beach expected the worst. Then, as if by grace or calculation, the skiffs converged, rowing hard through a corridor the observers could not read. Men loaded pushed off, and the first wave slipped past the burn and the gun flashes. Dozens were saved. Word of the 3 blasts spread in the way only desperate men can spread a story, clipped, shouted, and then somehow believed. But victory was an impatient mistress. The German Luftwaffe had eyes and a memory. Within hours, the beach was under renewed bombardment. A motor launch attempting to collect wounded was struck. The captain and several crew were thrown into the water. Jack saw the boat twist, heard a man give a sound that was half prayer and half shout. Without thinking, because experience and training can merge into a single reflex, Jack swam. He stripped his jacket and plunged into the cold. The tide yanked at him like an animal, but he crossed toward the burning launch and managed, with brute persistence, to pull 2 men clear. It was a reckless act in a place where recklessness could be fatal, but it was also the kind of action that made others move with more purpose. He hauled himself back onto the sand half exhausted, lungs burning, and found a small crowd around him. Faces of the saved men, eyes raw with gratitude. Commanders who saw courage and calculated what to do with it. And finally, someone Jack had not expected to see, Captain Ellis, the man who had briefed him at dawn and who usually spoke only in orders. Ellis looked him over, then handed him a small sealed packet. "You've done more than we asked," Ellis said in that flat voice that carried more credit than praise. "Take this to the engineer on Pier 3. Tell him to hold the lighter and stand by. There's one more run, one more window. You're going to mark it." Jack's chest tightened. He had been a runner, a savior of a few dozen souls, a man who had learned to read tides and the sleep of centuries. But the engineer at Pier 3 was known to be stubborn and exacting. To get him to move a lighter meant more than anyone else asking nicely. It took the kind of persuasive, quick thinking built on a threadbare trust. Jack buckled the rope around his shoulder and set off. The moment he stepped beyond the cluster of burned hulls, a new danger revealed itself. Among the wreckage, the gray shapes of German infantry began to move into the shallows, probing for stragglers. They were not loud and they did not shout. They moved with that analytic silence that betrays discipline. Jack saw them and counted, 3, then 5, and realized that their sweep would cut off the corridor he'd taken earlier. The window that Ellis had spoken of might close not because of tide, but because of an enemy flank. He angled toward the pier, keeping low and using the line of sunken barges as a blind. The engineer on Pier 3, a man named Harris, was in his usual place, swearing softly at a jammed winch. Jack slipped to his side, thrust the packet at him and said, "Now." Harris looked up, read the face of the man who had just risked everything on the sands, and without another word shoved the winch to life. The lighter groaned and came free. Smoke drifted. Men shouted. Harris, Jack, and a handful of seamen began to lower the fragile boat into a corridor that was now, by degree and decision, safer. What Jack did not know as the lighter slid into the water was that a German squad had observed the pier's movement and radioed the site to a command post inland. The radio voice was clipped, an indistinct lattice of language and numbers. The ripples of that message would reach an officer with a telescope and a cruel patience, someone who would not rush, but who would schedule his next move to align with the ebb and flow of the beach. In other words, this one more run might be the most dangerous yet. Jack's mark was in place. The lighter pushed off. Men leapt, were taken, and the skipper cut a path. For a breath Jack felt the world narrowly tilted toward grace. Then in the far dunes, a shell bloomed and the air filled with a rain of smoking shrapnel. Someone a yard away screamed. The lighter rocked. Ellis' shout cut the chaos. "Hold her steady, row." Jack gripped the rope with numb hands and breathed like a man who had just held his life together with 2 fingers. The lighter made it out. Dozens more men would not have to wait until morning for a chance. They were saved by a combination of planning, luck, and a scout who knew the beach's secrets. As the last skiff slid away and the sun began to fall, Jack allowed himself a moment to think about the 3 blasts, about the red scrap fluttering in the wind, about the thought that had crossed his mind when he first saw the smoke, that the beach was a ledger where each action wrote a line. He was tired, filthy, and alive. He had performed the small genius of recognition and timing again, but in the back of his mind an unease had settled. The German squad, the radioed sighting, the patient inland officer, they were variables he could not control. When the sun went down over Dunkirk that night, the evacuation looked less like a retreat and more like a long, precarious success. Men clung to ropes and hope, and Jack, so small in the volume of history, felt his name shrink under the tide. He had done something that mattered, but he sensed that the evening would not be a simple close. In the dark, someone was planning, and that plan would test every lesson he had learned: patience, timing, and the courage to act when the world demanded it. He wrapped his jacket tighter and watched the last lighter vanish into the seam of the horizon. The tide would come in again. The night would bring a new set of choices. And somewhere inland, a man with a telescope had just received the news he needed, that the enemy had a pattern, and patterns can be broken, if one is clever enough to break them first. The next morning, the beaches of Dunkirk were quieter, but only just. Smoke still curled from burning ships, and the smell of cordite lingered in every breeze. Jack Godfrey had slept little, dozing on a sandbag while listening to the waves crash against the battered piers. But dawn brought new orders. The evacuation was far from complete, and a fresh wave of soldiers still waited, trapped by the tide and enemy fire. Commanders needed someone who could think fast, act decisively, and manipulate both enemy and terrain to save lives. Jack was that someone. The intelligence from his earlier runs had been disseminated, but German observers were already adjusting. Snipers and small patrols patrolled the dunes, and artillery fire threatened to seal off the final corridor. Yet Jack had learned a simple truth. In war, timing, observation, and human ingenuity could outweigh sheer force. He studied the remaining gap in the evacuation route and devised a daring plan. Use the smoke from burning wrecks as cover. Lure enemy attention away from the skiffs, and signal the next wave of boats with a pattern only his team could understand. Crawling through shell-cratered sand, Jack moved like a shadow. He coordinated small teams, placed markers, and improvised cover for retreating soldiers. A small flare, carefully tossed into the sand, drew enemy fire while skiffs slipped past undetected. It was a risky combination of deception, quick thinking, and precise timing, a plan that depended on every individual knowing their role and trusting Jack's instinct. The operation worked. Dozens of boats slipped through, hundreds of soldiers escaped the beach, and even a damaged transport ship made it out with the wounded. Jack's actions had created a chain reaction. The German troops misread the beach, the Allies gained breathing room, and the evacuation succeeded against near-impossible odds. By evening, the retreat was largely complete. Officers and men alike marveled at what one scout had achieved. Jack Godfrey had not only survived, he had orchestrated one of the most ingenious small-scale operations of the Dunkirk evacuation, saving countless lives through courage, intellect, and resourcefulness. In the weeks and months that followed, his story became legend. Quietly awarded a medal for bravery, Jack returned to the ranks without seeking fame. Yet history remembered him, the mountain scout who turned observation, timing, and daring into life-saving genius, a single soldier who altered the course of a desperate operation. Even today, historians cite his work as a masterclass in small-unit ingenuity under extreme pressure. The lessons were clear. One man's intelligence, precision, and courage can tip the balance in a chaotic battle, proving that sometimes true heroism is the product of wit as much as bravery.